The sun hung low and mean over Black Hollow, turning the dust on Main Street into something that looked like ground bone. Ronin Vale rode in slow, the way a man does when he's learned that hurrying only invites trouble you haven't asked for yet. His horse, Ash, a black roan with eyes that missed nothing, moved beneath him with the careful economy of an animal that had crossed too many hard miles to waste energy on theater. Ronin wasn't looking for anything except water and a few hours where nobody knew his name. That should have been simple. In most towns it was. Black Hollow wasn't most towns. He noticed it first in the way people moved on the boardwalks. Eyes down, conversations cut short when strangers passed. The saloon doors hung crooked on their hinges, and the general store's windows were cleaner than its conscience probably was. Everything looked maintained just enough to suggest order, but not enough to suggest anyone cared. Ronin had seen towns like this before, places where something underneath the surface had gone wrong years ago, and everyone just learned to walk carefully around the rot. He guided Ash toward the water trough outside the livery. The horse lowered his head to drink, and Ronin loosened his grip on the reins, letting his shoulders drop half an inch. Not relaxed, he hadn't been actually relaxed since 1867, but something close to it. That lasted about 40 seconds. "That's a fine-looking animal." The voice came from behind him, smooth and practiced. Ronin didn't turn immediately. He'd learned that men who opened conversations by commenting on your horse usually wanted something that wasn't theirs. "He does his job," Ronin said. "I bet he does." The man stepped into Ronin's peripheral vision, mid-40s, clean clothes that cost more than they should in a town this size. A smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "Name's Fletcher. I work for the Territorial Collections Office." Ronin said nothing. Ash kept drinking. Fletcher's smile adjusted itself, became a degree less friendly. "We've got some business to discuss, official business." "Don't have business here," Ronin said. "Just passing through. See? That's where you're wrong." Fletcher pulled a folded document from inside his coat, the paper making a crisp sound that probably impressed people who didn't know better. "This is a notice of secured debt collection, authorized by the Territorial Court, and endorsed by Mercer Hale of the Black Hollow Commercial Bank." Ronin finally turned to look at him. "Never heard of it." "The bank or the debt?" "Both." Fletcher's smile went away entirely. He unfolded the paper with the deliberate care of a man who'd done this before and expected it to work. 6 years ago, a man calling himself Robert Vance borrowed $200 from Mr. Hale's institution. The loan was properly notarized. Collateral was listed as one black roan gelding, 4 years old, answering to the name Ash. Something cold moved through Ronin's chest, but his face didn't change. "That's a common enough name for a horse." "Is it?" Fletcher looked past Ronin toward Ash, who had finished drinking and was now watching both men with the kind of attention horses only give to situations that might turn bad. "Because the description here is pretty specific. Black coat with roan flecking on the hindquarters, white star on the forehead shaped like a knife blade, notch in the left ear from an old injury." Ronin didn't need to look. He knew every mark on Ash's hide, including the ones that hadn't been there 6 years ago. "The debt went into default 4 years back," Fletcher continued. "With accumulated interest and collection fees, the total now stands at $840. Mr. Hale is prepared to take possession of the collateral immediately, as is his legal right under territorial statute." "That's a lot of money for a horse someone might have borrowed against," Ronin said carefully. "Interest compounds, so do collection fees." Fletcher tucked the paper back into his coat. "It's all perfectly legal." "I'm sure it is." "So we can do this the easy way, or—" "There's always an or, isn't there?" Ronin interrupted. His voice hadn't gotten louder, but something in it made Fletcher take a half step back. "Men like you always got an or waiting in your pocket." "Or," Fletcher said, and now there was an edge in his tone that suggested he'd been hoping to skip this part. "We can involve the sheriff and his deputies. Either way, that horse is coming with us." Ronin looked at Ash. The horse's ears were pinned back now, reading the tension the way animals do when they've spent enough years keeping a man alive to know when violence is about to show up. "You really want to do this?" Ronin asked quietly. "It's not about want. It's about law." "Right." Ronin's hand moved, not toward his gun, not yet, just adjusting his coat, and Fletcher's eyes tracked the motion like a man watching a snake. "So where's this sheriff you mentioned?" Fletcher didn't smile, but something close to satisfaction moved across his face. He turned and whistled, two sharp notes that carried down the street. Men started appearing, not quickly, not like an ambush, but with the casual confidence of people who'd done this before and knew how it ended. They came out of the saloon, stepped down from the general store, emerged from the alley beside the bank. 8 of them, all told, all armed, all wearing expressions that suggested they were bored with this but willing to see it through. The last man to arrive wore a tin star on his vest. Sheriff Elias Crow looked like he'd started out meaning well and then spent 20 years learning that meaning well didn't pay as reliably as meaning profitable. He was maybe 60, with gray threading through his hair and lines around his eyes that came from looking away from things he should have stopped. "Mr. Vale," Crow said, and Ronin noticed the sheriff already knew his name. "I've reviewed the documentation. It's legitimate. I'm going to have to ask you to hand over the reins." "You reviewed it, did you?" Ronin said. "I did. And you think it's legitimate." "The court thinks it's legitimate." Crow's voice carried the particular weariness of a man who'd learned to hide behind process. "That's what matters." "That all that matters? In this town?" "Yes." Ronin looked around at the 8 men forming a loose circle around him and Ash. None of them had drawn weapons yet, but hands hovered near belts and coat pockets. They weren't fighters. He could tell that from how they stood, from the way their eyes kept flicking toward Fletcher for reassurance. These were men who'd gotten used to winning through numbers and paperwork, not skill. That almost made it worse. "I knew a man once," Ronin said, still not moving. "Worked as a claims adjuster for a mining company. His job was reviewing accident reports, deciding whether the company owed compensation to widows." Nobody said anything. Down the street, a door closed. Someone had decided they didn't want to see what happened next. "He was real good at his job," Ronin continued. "Found all kinds of reasons why the company didn't owe anything. Improper safety procedures, contributory negligence, failure to follow posted guidelines." Ronin's eyes moved from man to man, landing on each face just long enough to make them uncomfortable. "Everything he did was legitimate, legal, proper." "What's your point?" Fletcher asked. "He died badly," Ronin said. "Fell down a mine shaft someone had forgotten to mark with posted guidelines. They ruled it an accident. Very legal, very proper." The silence that followed had teeth in it. "Are you threatening us?" One of the enforcers, younger than the others, with the kind of mustache men grew when they wanted to look dangerous but hadn't figured out how yet, took a step forward. "No," Ronin said. "I'm giving you information you can use to make better decisions." "The decision's already made," Fletcher said. "Hand over the horse, or we take him." Ronin looked at Ash again. The horse was watching him now, waiting. They'd been through enough together that Ash could probably feel what was coming before Ronin himself knew for certain. 6 years ago," Ronin said slowly, "I was in a bad situation. Man I was traveling with got shot during a robbery. Wasn't his fault. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong men who didn't care about the difference. He needed a doctor, and the only one within 50 miles wanted cash up front." "That's a touching story," Fletcher said. "Doesn't change the debt." "I'm not saying it does." Ronin's voice stayed level. "I used a fake name because I didn't want anyone finding me. I listed Ash as collateral because I knew I'd pay it back before the loan came due. And I would have, except the doctor took the money and let my friend die anyway. So I killed him." That got their attention. "Killed him slow," Ronin continued, and now there was something in his voice that made even Fletcher's confidence waver. "Made sure he understood exactly why it was happening. Then I rode out and never looked back. Figured the debt would just disappear into whatever happened to paperwork in a territory this size." "Well, it didn't," Crow said quietly. "No, I can see that." Ronin shifted his weight, and every armed man in the circle tensed. "So here's what's interesting. You're all standing here with legal documents backed by a banker I've never met, enforced by a sheriff who looks like he stopped sleeping well about 10 years ago. All of you acting like the paper in Fletcher's pocket means something more important than common sense." "Law's law," the young one said. "Is it?" Ronin looked at him. "You ever wonder why this collection office of yours only seems to show up for people passing through? People who can't fight back, who don't have family in town, who'll be gone or dead before anyone asks uncomfortable questions?" "We operate according to territorial statute," Fletcher started. You operate according to what Mercer Hale tells you to operate according to. Ronin cut him off. And Hale operates according to what makes Hale money. That's not law. That's just theft with better paperwork. You calling us thieves? Another enforcer, older with a scar across his knuckles that suggested he'd done harder work before this, moved his hand closer to his belt. I'm calling you men who probably started out thinking you were doing something legitimate, and then stopped asking questions right around the time the pay got good enough. Ronin's eyes moved to Crow. How much does Hale pay you to look the other way, Sheriff? Crow's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. Doesn't matter, Ronin said. Not really. Because here's what's going to happen. You're all going to step back, turn around, and walk away. I'm going to water my horse, maybe get a meal, and then ride out before sunset, and we're all going to pretend this conversation never happened. Fletcher actually laughed. It wasn't a pleasant sound. You think you can just, Ronin said, and the single word carried enough weight to stop Fletcher mid-sentence. We can do this the way you wanted to do it. The 8 of you can try to take Ash by force. Some of you will probably succeed. Numbers matter, and I'm not claiming I can take all of you before someone gets lucky. But before that happens, at least 3 of you will be bleeding in this street. And you'll have to explain to Mercer Hale why his profitable little system suddenly costs him the expense of funerals and the attention of territorial marshals asking why a debt collection turned into a gunfight. Nobody moved. Your choice, Ronin said. But make it now, because my patience just ran out. For maybe 10 seconds, it could have gone either way. Ronin could see it in their faces, the calculation, the doubt, the slow realization that legal documents didn't stop bullets. Fletcher's hand trembled slightly. The young one with the bad mustache looked toward Crow, waiting for orders that didn't come. Then Ash moved. Not much, just a shift of weight, a toss of his head, but enough to make the man closest to him flinch backward. And in that flinch, everyone saw what Ronin had known from the start. These men weren't ready for this. They were accustomed to threats working. They'd forgotten what happened when threats failed. Take your hand off my horse, Ronin said quietly. He'd been saying it in his head for the last minute, but now it came out loud, and there was something final in the way the words landed. Fletcher heard it. So did Crow. So did every man in that circle who had enough experience to recognize the sound of a door closing. The young one didn't hear it. He reached for Ash's reins. What happened next was messy and brutal and over too fast for most people watching to understand the sequence. Ash reared, not high, just enough to drive his shoulder into the young man's chest and send him stumbling backward into one of the other enforcers. Ronin moved at the same instant, his hand closing around Fletcher's wrist. Before the man could draw the pistol, everyone suddenly remembered he was carrying. There was a crack, bone or wood or something, and Fletcher screamed. Then Ronin had the gun. He didn't fire it, didn't need to, just held it loose and ready, while 8 men discovered they'd badly misjudged both their opponent and their own willingness to die over someone else's paperwork. Anyone else? Ronin asked. The scarred one raised his hand slowly, deliberately. We're done. We're not done, Fletcher gasped, cradling his wrist. This is assault on a territorial officer. You're not an officer, Ronin said. You're a collections agent with delusions. And if you want to press charges, I'll be happy to explain to a federal judge exactly how Mercer Hale's banking operation works. Think you'd be interested? Fletcher's face went white. That's what I thought. Ronin ejected the bullets from Fletcher's pistol, pocketed them, and tossed the empty gun into the water trough. Sheriff, you want to arrest me? Go ahead. But you better be real sure about which side of this you want to be on when people start asking questions. Crow looked old suddenly. Older than 60. Older than the lines around his eyes suggested. He looked at Ronin, then at Fletcher, then at the crowd that had gathered on the boardwalks. Townspeople who'd watched the whole thing with expressions that ranged from shock to something that might have been satisfaction. No arrest, Crow said finally. Everyone go home. Sheriff, Fletcher started. I said go home. Crow's voice carried an authority that had been missing before, like he'd remembered something he'd forgotten for too long. All of you. Now. They went. Slowly, reluctantly, casting looks back over their shoulders that promised this wasn't over. Fletcher went last, still cradling his wrist, his face twisted with humiliation and rage. When they were gone, Crow turned to Ronin. You should leave, tonight. I should. Ronin agreed. But you're not going to. No. Why not? Ronin looked down the street toward the bank, a two-story building that dominated the town's center, its windows reflecting the setting sun like eyes. Because Fletcher was right about one thing. That debt was real. I did borrow that money. I did list Ash as collateral. So I don't run from debts, but I also don't let people use legitimate debts to cover up illegitimate systems. Ronin met Crow's eyes. How many people has Hale done this to? The sheriff didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was barely above a whisper. I stopped counting after a dozen. Travelers? Mostly, people passing through. Some stayed long enough to realize fighting would cost more than losing. Some. Crow trailed off. Some what? Some disappeared. Crow looked away. Could be they just moved on. Could be they're buried somewhere in the hills where nobody asks questions. And you let it happen. I'm one man. Hale owns half this town. The territorial judge is his brother-in-law. The land office, the assay office, even the church. He's got his fingers in everything. Crow's shoulders sagged. What was I supposed to do? Your job, Ronin said, and there was no kindness in it. Crow flinched like he'd been struck. For a moment he looked like he might say something, defend himself, explain, justify 20 years of looking away. Then he just nodded once and walked away, his boots dragging in the dust like they weighed more than they had that morning. Ronin watched him go. Then he turned to find an old man standing in the doorway of the livery, leaning on a cane that looked like it had been leaning on him for just as long. You got a death wish, son? The old man asked. Probably, Ronin said. Well, that's honest, at least. The old man's name was Gideon Pike, and he looked like he'd been part of the livery so long that removing him might bring the whole structure down. Stable's got room if you're staying. 2 bits a night for the horse, another 2 for a cot in the back room. I'm staying. Figured. Gideon stepped aside to let Ronin lead Ash into the barn. Inside it smelled like hay and leather and horse sweat, familiar smells that made something in Ronin's chest loosen slightly. Food's extra, but I cook better than the hotel, and they water down the coffee anyway. Appreciate it. They got Ash settled in a stall that had clean straw and a feed bucket that didn't have holes in it. The horse relaxed immediately, which told Ronin more about Gideon's character than words would have. Animals knew things people tried to hide. You really plan on going after Hale? Gideon asked when they were sitting on empty crates outside the stable, watching the sun finish dying behind the hills. I plan on figuring out what's true and what isn't, Ronin said. Same thing in this town. Maybe. Definitely. Gideon pulled out a pipe, packed it with tobacco that smelled like it had been aging since before the war. You want to know what you're walking into? I already know what I'm walking into. No, son. You know what you think you're walking into. There's a difference. Gideon lit the pipe, and smoke curled up toward the darkening sky. Mercer Hale came here 15 years ago with more money than anyone had seen in one place and a smile that made people forget to ask where it came from. Built that bank, offered loans when the territorial banks wouldn't, helped people when they needed it. And then he started collecting. Not just money, everything. Land deeds when crops failed, business partnerships when debts came due, collateral when loans defaulted, which they always did because Hale wrote the terms to make sure of it. Gideon exhaled smoke. 10 years ago, this was a decent town. 5 years ago, it was a nervous town. Now it's Hale's town. Everyone else just lives here. Why do they stay? Where else would they go? Most folks got everything they own tied up in this place. Leave and they lose it all. Stay and they might lose it slow instead of fast. People convince themselves slow is better. Is it? Hell no, Gideon said. Slow just means you watch it happening. They sat in silence for a while. Down the street, lamps were being lit in windows. Normal evening sounds drifted through the air. A child laughing, a dog barking, someone playing a harmonica badly. The sounds of a town pretending it was okay. The debt collector, Fletcher, Ronin said eventually. He's done this before. Dozens of times. And nobody stopped him. Nobody could. Gideon looked at Ronin sideways. Until today. You embarrassed him. Made him look weak in front of the whole town. Men like Fletcher, they don't forgive that. Good. Good? If he comes after me, that's easier than going after him. Self-defense looks better to judges than premeditated violence. Gideon laughed, a short, sharp sound without much humor in it. You've thought this through. I've been thinking about it for 6 years. Ronin stood, stretched muscles that had been riding tense since he'd entered town. Question is whether anyone in this town is willing to stand up when it matters. I'm too old to stand. But you're not too old to sit there and watch. No, Gideon admitted. I'm not too old for that. That's what I thought. Ronin headed toward the livery door. I'm going to get some sleep. If anyone comes looking for me tonight, they'll have to go through me first. That's not what I was going to say. I know, but it's what I'm saying. Gideon puffed on his pipe. Get some rest, son. Tomorrow's going to be interesting. It was the kind of interesting that people usually meant when they were predicting violence. Ronin didn't sleep well, never did in new places, and this wasn't even pretending to be a safe one. He kept Fletcher's bullets in his pocket, where he could feel them against his leg. Small metal reminders that the conversation was far from over. Somewhere around midnight, he heard footsteps outside the stable. 2 sets, moving carefully. Ronin's hand found his gun in the darkness, and he waited. The footsteps stopped. There was a long pause, then voices, low, arguing. Told you it was stupid. Just looking. We're not... Gideon's watching from the loft. You idiot. The footsteps retreated. In the morning, Ronin found Gideon sitting in the same spot as the night before, like he hadn't moved. Maybe he hadn't. Friends of yours? Ronin asked. Fletcher's boys, sent to see if you were really staying. Gideon knocked ash from his pipe. They left when I made it clear I wasn't sleeping either. You didn't have to do that. I know. Gideon stood with effort, joints popping. But I'm tired of watching bad things happen to people who don't deserve them. Figured I could at least make sure one person got through a night alive. Appreciate it. Don't appreciate it yet. Day's just starting. Gideon was right about that. Ronin stepped outside to find Black Hollow looking different in daylight. Or maybe he was just seeing it more clearly. The prosperity he'd noticed yesterday was a veneer over something hollow. Stores that should have been busy were empty. People walked with their heads down, avoiding each other's eyes. Even the sunlight seemed reluctant to touch certain buildings. He walked to the general store, bought coffee and hardtack, and listened to the silence around him. The storekeeper, a thin woman with hands that shook when she counted change, didn't meet his eyes once during the transaction. Ma'am, Ronin said as she handed him the package. Can I ask you something? She flinched. I don't want trouble. Neither do I. Just want to know if you've seen people like me before. People who rode through, had paper served on them, lost whatever Hale decided they'd lost. Please, she whispered. He'll what? Take your store? I'm betting he already owns it, or most of it. Debt you can't quite pay off, right? Terms that change just enough to keep you working but never getting clear? Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't answer. That's what I thought, Ronin said gently. He left coins on the counter, more than the purchase cost. For the information you didn't give me. Outside, he found Crow waiting by the water trough. You're still here, the sheriff said. I'm still here. Hale knows. He wants to see you. Does he? Noon, at the bank, he said to tell you it's not optional. Everything's optional, Ronin said. But I'll come anyway. I've got questions he might be willing to answer. He's not going to answer anything. He's going to make you an offer. What kind of offer? Crow hesitated. The kind that comes with consequences for refusing. Those are my favorite kind, Ronin said. At 11:30, Ronin saddled Ash and rode him slowly through town, making sure everyone saw. Making sure they remembered that the horse was still his, that yesterday's confrontation hadn't ended the way Hale wanted it to end. Small rebellions mattered in towns where big ones got you killed. The bank was exactly what he'd expected, all dark wood and polished brass and the smell of money that had been counted too many times. A clerk met him at the door, looked nervous, and gestured toward the stairs. Second floor. He's waiting. Ronin climbed the stairs, his boots loud on wood that probably cost more than most people in Black Hollow earned in a year. At the top, a door stood open. Inside, Mercer Hale sat behind a desk that could have doubled as a small fortress. He wasn't what Ronin had pictured. Younger, maybe 45, with the kind of face that belonged in church paintings of reasonable men making reasonable decisions. Everything about him was carefully arranged. The suit, the haircut, the expression of mild concern that suggested he genuinely cared about the problem they were about to discuss. "Mr. Vale," Hale said. His voice matched his face, reasonable, measured, the kind of voice that made lies sound like obvious truths. "Thank you for coming. Didn't have much choice. Everyone has choices." Hale gestured to a chair across from the desk. "Please, sit." Ronin stayed standing. "As you prefer." Hale opened a folder on his desk, the same folder Fletcher had been carrying yesterday. "I understand there was an unpleasant incident regarding your debt obligation." That's one way to describe it. Mr. Fletcher can be overzealous. I apologize if his approach seemed aggressive. Hale's tone suggested he was describing a minor social faux pas, not an attempted armed robbery. However, the underlying facts remain unchanged. You borrowed money under the name Robert Vance. You listed a black roan gelding as collateral. The debt went into default, and standard collection procedures were initiated. "Standard," Ronin repeated. "Entirely standard. I have documentation for every step, should you wish to review it." "I'm sure you do." Hale smiled slightly. "You think I'm a criminal. I think you're a man who's very good at staying on the right side of documentation while doing wrong things." "That's quite an accusation." "It's an observation. There's a difference." They studied each other across the desk. Hale's smile never wavered, but something shifted in his eyes, a recalculation, an adjustment of strategy. "Let me make you an offer," Hale said finally. "You pay what you actually borrowed, the original $200, and we forget the accumulated interest and fees. You keep your horse, I keep my reputation intact. Everyone leaves satisfied. And the next traveler who rides through? The one who doesn't fight back? That's not your concern." "Maybe it should be." "Mr. Vale." Now Hale's smile had edges. "You're a drifter, a man who's been running from something for years. I don't know what, and I don't particularly care. You'll take this deal, pay your debt, and move on. Because the alternative is that I make one telegram to my brother-in-law, the judge, and you spend the next 6 months in a territorial prison cell while courts sort out what you did to Mr. Fletcher. You'd have to prove what I did to Fletcher. I have 8 witnesses. You have 8 men who'll lie for you as long as they're getting paid. But put them under oath in front of a federal marshal asking why a debt collection required that many armed men, and I wonder how consistent their stories stay." Hale's smile vanished. "You're making a serious mistake." "I've made plenty of those. What's one more?" Ronin turned toward the door. "Here's my counteroffer. You open your books. All of them. Let me see every loan, every debt, every collection you've made in the last 10 years. I'll compare what people were supposed to owe with what they actually paid, and we'll see if everything adds up as neatly as you claim." "That's absurd." "Is it? Because if everything's legitimate, you've got nothing to hide. And if it's not—" Ronin paused at the doorway. "Well, then we both know what you are." "I own this town," Hale said quietly. "No. You've convinced this town you own it. There's a difference." Ronin looked back over his shoulder. "And that difference is about to matter." He walked out before Hale could respond, his heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the sudden certainty that he'd just declared a war he had no good plan for winning. Outside, Ash was waiting where he'd left him, unbothered by the tension crackling through Black Hollow like distant lightning. Ronin mounted up and rode toward the stable, thinking about documents and lies, and the way truth sometimes needed a crowbar to pry it free from where it was hiding. Behind him, in the second-floor window of the bank, Mercer Hale watched and made calculations of his own. The day was only half over. It was about to get worse. The rest of that afternoon crawled by like something wounded. Ronin spent it in the stable with Gideon, pretending to care about brushing Ash down while his mind worked through the problem Mercer Hale represented. The problem wasn't just Hale. Men like him existed in every territory, finding new ways to dress up theft in respectable clothes. The problem was that Hale had built a system that protected itself, layer after layer of legitimate-looking documentation covering the rot underneath. Gideon didn't ask questions, which Ronin appreciated. The old man just moved around the stable doing work that probably didn't need doing, staying close enough that his presence felt like solidarity without demanding conversation. Around 4 in the afternoon, he finally broke the silence. "You know they're watching you." Ronin glanced toward the street. Two men leaned against the building opposite, making no effort to hide their attention. I noticed. Fletcher's idea or Hale's? Does it matter? Suppose not. Gideon poured water into a bucket with hands that shook slightly. Age or something else, Ronin couldn't tell. You planning on doing something stupid? Depends on your definition of stupid. The kind that gets you killed in an alley. Then no, Ronin said. I'm planning on doing something that looks stupid but might actually work. That's reassuring. Wasn't meant to be. They fell quiet again. The shadows lengthened across Main Street, and the men watching Ronin didn't move. Shift change came at sundown. The two watchers were replaced by two others, these ones bigger and meaner looking. The message was clear. Hale wanted Ronin to know he was contained, controlled, a problem that had been handled even if it hadn't been solved. That confidence was going to cost him. Around 7, when the last of the daylight was draining from the sky like water from a cracked bucket, someone unexpected showed up at the stable. Ronin recognized him from yesterday, one of the enforcers who'd surrounded him at the water trough. Not the young one who'd reached for Ash, and not the scarred one who'd been smart enough to surrender. This was one of the middle ones, the kind of man who'd learned to be invisible by never being first or last to do anything. He stood in the stable doorway, looking uncomfortable, his hat in his hands. Mr. Vale? Ronin set down the curry brush he'd been using. That's me. My name's Dorian Marsh. The man shifted his weight from foot to foot. I was there yesterday, with Fletcher. I remember. I didn't want... Dorian stopped, started again. What I mean is, I need to tell you something about how all this works. Gideon moved closer, interested now. Ronin gestured toward an empty crate. Sit. Dorian sat like a man who expected the crate to collapse under him. He turned his hat in his hands, not meeting anyone's eyes. I've been working collections for Hale for 3 years. Started after my farm went under. Bad harvest, worse luck, and debts that kept growing no matter how much I paid. Hale bought up my note from the territorial bank, said he'd give me work to pay it off. Let me guess, Ronin said. The work pays just enough to keep you fed, but never quite enough to clear the debt. Every month there's new fees, service charges, administrative costs, interest recalculations. Dorian's voice was hollow. I owe more now than when I started. So why are you here? Because what happened yesterday, what you did, it's the first time I've seen anyone stand up to the system and not get crushed immediately. Dorian finally looked up, and his eyes were haunted. And because if I keep doing this, keep helping Hale destroy people, I won't be able to live with myself much longer. Noble sentiment, Ronin said, but sentiment doesn't give me anything I can use. I know where he keeps the real books. That got Ronin's full attention. The real books. The ones that show what people actually borrowed versus what they paid back. The ones that list all the fake fees and the documentation that got altered after the fact. Dorian's hands tightened on his hat. He keeps them in his office at the bank, in a safe behind a painting of some mountain range nobody's ever heard of. 3 people have the combination. Hale, his clerk Thomas Whitmore, and Fletcher. And you know this how? Because I helped move the safe when he had the office remodeled last year. And because Fletcher drinks too much and talks when he's drunk about how untouchable they are, how even if someone accused them, the evidence is locked up tighter than a drum. Gideon whistled low. You're talking about breaking into a bank. I'm talking about getting evidence, Ronin corrected. Breaking into a bank is just one way to do it. It's the only way, Dorian said. Hale doesn't leave those books out where anyone can see them. The ledgers he shows people, the ones that look official, those are clean. Boring. Everything adds up perfectly because they're fiction. The real accounting, the one that shows how much he's actually stolen, that's locked away. Ronin studied him. Why should I trust you? You shouldn't. Dorian's voice was flat. I've done terrible things for that man. Helped ruin families, stood by while people lost everything. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just asking for a chance to make one thing right before I run out of time to make anything right. Hale finds out you talked to me. He'll kill me. I know. Dorian stood, put his hat back on. But he's going to kill me anyway, eventually. Everyone who works for him either ends up dead or wishing they were. At least this way, maybe I'll have done something that matters. He left before Ronin could respond, slipping out into the gathering darkness like a man who'd spent too long practicing how to disappear. Gideon let out a breath. Well, that was unexpected. Was it? Ronin picked up the curry brush again, went back to working on Ash's coat. Man like Hale, he doesn't inspire loyalty. He buys it, and bought things break when pressure gets applied. You believe him? About the books? Doesn't matter if I believe him. Matters if he's useful. Ronin paused. But yeah, I believe him. He's got the look. What look? The one men get when they've compromised themselves one too many times and suddenly realize there's nothing left to compromise. It makes them dangerous, not to their enemies, but to the people who thought they owned them. Gideon settled onto his crate with a grunt. So you're actually going to do it? Break into Hale's bank? I'm going to think about it, Ronin said. There's a difference. But he was already thinking about it, had been, since Dorian mentioned the safe. The question wasn't whether to do it. The question was how to do it without getting shot, arrested, or both. Breaking into a bank in a town where the sheriff answered to the banker was a good way to end up dead in a cell with no witnesses to explain what happened. He needed more than just information about where the books were kept. He needed leverage, distraction, and a way out that didn't involve riding through a hail of bullets. He needed help. The problem was that everyone in Black Hollow who might be willing to help was too terrified of Hale to act, and everyone who wasn't terrified was on Hale's payroll, except for Gideon, who was too old, and Dorian, who was too compromised to be trusted completely, and maybe Sheriff Elias Crow, who was too tired. That last thought stuck with him through dinner, beans and hardtack that Gideon heated over a small stove in the stable's back room, and into the evening. Crow had looked genuinely ashamed yesterday when Ronin called him out for letting Hale's operation continue. Shame was a lever. Not a strong one, but sometimes weak levers were all you had. Around 9, Ronin told Gideon he was going for a walk. The men watching you won't like that. Good, Ronin said. He stepped out into the street. The night air was cool, carrying the smell of wood smoke and distant rain. The two men Hale had posted outside the stable straightened when they saw him, their hands moving toward weapons. Ronin walked right past them. Hey, one of them called. You're supposed to stay. I'm going to the sheriff's office, Ronin said without stopping. You want to shoot me for that? Go ahead. See how it looks when people ask questions. They didn't shoot him, but they followed, keeping maybe 20 feet back. Their footsteps echoed on the boardwalk, loud enough that anyone still awake would hear and know something was happening. That was fine. Ronin wanted people to notice. The sheriff's office sat at the end of Main Street, a squat building that had probably been whitewashed once but now looked gray in the lamplight. A single window glowed yellow. Ronin pushed open the door without knocking. Crow looked up from the desk where he'd been staring at a half-empty bottle of whiskey, like it might have answers he needed. He didn't seem surprised to see Ronin. Figured you'd show up eventually. Need to talk, Ronin said. Can't imagine we have much to say to each other. Then you've got a failure of imagination. Ronin closed the door, shutting out the night and the men who'd followed him. How long have you been sheriff? 22 years. Why? That's a long time to watch a town die. Crow's jaw tightened. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? Let me tell you what I see. Ronin sat down in the chair across from Crow's desk, uninvited. I see a man who probably started this job because he wanted to help people, wanted to be the kind of sheriff kids looked up to, the kind who kept folks safe and made sure justice meant something. Get out. I see a man who made compromises. Small ones at first. Look the other way here. Bend a rule there. Always for good reasons. Always temporary. Always planning to fix it later when circumstances were better. Ronin's voice was flat, factual. But circumstances never got better. The compromises got bigger. And one day you woke up and realized you'd become the thing you swore you'd never be. A lawman who enforces money instead of law. Crow's hand moved toward the bottle, stopped. You finished? Almost. I see a man who's tired, who knows exactly what he's become, and hates it, but doesn't know how to stop, because stopping means admitting 20 years of failure, means accepting that every person who suffered under Hale's system suffered partly because you were too afraid, or too tired, or too compromised to stop it. I said, get out. I heard you. Ronin didn't move. But here's the interesting part. Despite all that, despite the compromises and the failures and the whiskey you're using to forget what you see in the mirror, you're still a man who feels shame. Yesterday proved it. When I called you out in front of the town, you felt it. Maybe you've been feeling it for years and just got good at ignoring it. What do you want from me? Crow's voice was barely above a whisper. I want to know if there's anything left of the man who pinned that badge on 22 years ago. Because if there is, even just a scrap of him, I can work with that. Work with it how? By doing what you should have done years ago, by stopping Mercer Hale. Crow laughed, a bitter, broken sound. You're insane. You can't stop Hale. He owns everything. The judge, the land office, half the businesses in town. You think one drifter with a grudge is going to bring down an entire system? No, Ronin said. I think one drifter and a sheriff who remembers what his badge used to mean might have a chance. Maybe not a good chance, but a chance. Why would I risk everything on might? Because you've already lost everything that matters. Your integrity, your self-respect, the ability to sleep through the night without needing that bottle. Ronin gestured toward the whiskey. What else have you got to lose? Crow stared at him for a long moment. Outside, the men who'd followed Ronin were probably getting antsy, wondering what was being discussed inside. Let them wonder. What would you need from me? Crow asked finally. Truth. Documentation. Your testimony about how Hale's system really works. Ronin leaned forward. And help getting into his office at the bank. You want me to help you break into... Crow stopped, shook his head. That's not happening. Why not? Because it's illegal, dangerous, and likely to get both of us killed. As opposed to what? Sitting here drinking yourself toward a death that'll come slower but feel worse? Ronin's voice hardened. I've met a lot of men in your position, Sheriff. Men who let things get away from them, made compromises they couldn't take back. You know what the difference is between the ones who die with some dignity and the ones who die hating themselves? What? The ones who die with dignity stop compromising, even if it costs them, even if it's too late to fix everything. They draw a line and say, not anymore, not today, not while I'm still breathing. Ronin stood. So that's my question. Are you the kind of man who can draw that line? Or are you the kind who's going to sit here until Hale decides you're more trouble than you're worth, and has someone put a bullet in you during a convenient robbery? Crow's face had gone pale. Wouldn't He absolutely would. You know too much. You're a liability that gets bigger every day. Right now, you're useful enough that keeping you alive makes sense, but that calculation changes the moment you stop being useful or start being dangerous. Ronin moved toward the door. Think about it. And when you've thought about it, decide who you want to be for whatever time you've got left. He left before Crow could respond, stepping back into the night. The two men who'd been waiting outside straightened, trying to look intimidating. Ronin walked past them again, heading back toward the stable. They followed, of course. Their orders probably included making sure he didn't leave town, didn't cause trouble, didn't do anything except wait quietly to be dealt with. Ronin let them follow. Let them think they were containing him. He was done being contained. Back at the stable, Gideon had coffee waiting. Real coffee, not the watered-down version they served at the hotel. Ronin accepted the cup gratefully. How'd it go? Hard to say. Either I just recruited the sheriff, or I convinced him to have me arrested. Ronin sipped the coffee. It was strong enough to strip paint. Could go either way. You always this optimistic? Only when things are going well. Gideon snorted. If this is well, I'd hate to see bad. They sat in companionable silence, drinking coffee that was probably older than some of the buildings in Black Hollow. Outside, the town settled into its uneasy sleep, the kind where everyone lay awake listening for trouble they knew was coming but couldn't predict. Around midnight, someone knocked on the stable door. Ronin's hand found his gun before he was fully conscious of moving. Gideon was faster than his age suggested, already positioned where he could see whoever entered without being seen himself. It's me, Crow's voice, rough and tired. Let me in. Gideon opened the door. The sheriff slipped inside, glanced around to make sure the watchers outside hadn't seen him. He looked older than he had a few hours ago, like deciding something had cost him years he couldn't spare. I'll help you, Crow said without preamble. But we do this my way. Careful, planned. No shooting unless there's no other choice. Agreed, Ronin said. And if we get caught, when we get caught, because we will, I don't know you. You forced me, threatened me. Whatever story keeps me alive long enough to testify if this somehow works. Fair enough. Crow pulled a chair closer, sat down heavily. The bank has 2 points of entry. Front door, heavy oak, reinforced lock, opens onto Main Street where anyone could see. Back door, lighter, older, opens into an alley that's dark enough to hide a dozen sins. Guards? One night watchman, name's Porter, ex-miner, lost 3 fingers to a collapsed shaft, works for Hale because nobody else will hire him. He's not loyal, just desperate. Carries a shotgun he's probably never fired. When does he make his rounds? Every hour on the hour, checks the front, walks the perimeter, checks the back. Takes him maybe 10 minutes. Between rounds, he sits in a room off the main floor and drinks coffee to stay awake. Ronin processed this. What about the safe? Behind a painting in Hale's office, like your friend said. Combination lock. I don't know the combination, but... Crow hesitated. But what? But Hale's clerk, Thomas Whitmore, keeps a written copy. He's terrified of forgetting it and losing access. Keeps the paper in his desk drawer in a locked compartment. Where we'd need to break into to get to it. Where you'd need to pick the lock to get to it, Crow corrected. It's a simple mechanism. Anyone with basic skills could manage it. Gideon cleared his throat. Sounds like you've given this considerable thought, Sheriff. I've had years to think about it, Crow said quietly. Every night, lying awake, running through scenarios, telling myself I'd do something about Hale tomorrow, always tomorrow. He looked at Ronin. You showing up, what you did yesterday, it made tomorrow into today. I don't know if I should thank you or curse you for it. Save both until we see if this works, Ronin said. When? Tomorrow night. New moon. Darkest it'll be all month. That's fast. Has to be. Hale's already planning something. I can see it in how he's moving people around, giving orders. Whatever he's got planned for you, it's happening soon. We move first, or we don't move at all. Ronin didn't like it. Fast meant sloppy, and sloppy got people killed. But Crow was right. Waiting gave Hale time to prepare, time to remove evidence, time to make whatever move he'd been calculating since yesterday's confrontation. What do you need from me? Ronin asked. Stay visible tomorrow. Keep Hale's attention on you. Let him think you're predictable, contained, waiting for him to make his play. Crow stood. And be ready to move at 1 in the morning. That's when Porter takes his longest break, 15 minutes instead of 10. If we're going to do this, that's our window. What about Dorian? The man who told me about the safe. What about him? He offered to help, said he knows the building layout. Crow shook his head. Too risky. The more people involved, the more chances for something to go wrong. Besides, Dorian's compromised. If Hale suspects anything, he'll question his own people first. Dorian wouldn't last 5 minutes under pressure. He seemed sincere. Sincere people make terrible conspirators. They care too much about doing the right thing and not enough about surviving. Crow moved toward the door. 1 in the morning, back alley. Come alone. What about your watchers? Gideon gestured toward the street where Hale's men were presumably still stationed. I'll handle them, Crow said. It's amazing what a badge can do when you remember how to use it. He slipped out into the darkness, leaving Ronin and Gideon staring at each other. Well, Gideon said eventually, this is either the bravest thing I've seen in 40 years or the stupidest. Could be both, Ronin said. Usually is. Sleep didn't come easy that night, and when it did, it was shallow and full of dreams about locked doors and combination safes that wouldn't open. Ronin woke twice to the sound of footsteps that turned out to be nothing, his hand on his gun and sweat cooling on his skin. The next day stretched out like taffy, long and sticky and refusing to move at a reasonable pace. Ronin did what Crow had suggested, stayed visible. He walked Ash up and down Main Street, stopped at the general store, sat outside the saloon nursing a beer he barely touched. Every movement calculated to say he was waiting, passive, not planning anything that required stealth or preparation. Hale's watchers followed him everywhere, no longer pretending subtlety. That was fine. The more attention on him, the less on what might happen tonight. Around 2 in the afternoon, Ronin was standing outside the general store when he noticed something that made his skin prickle. Fletcher, wrist still bandaged from their encounter, was talking to 3 men Ronin hadn't seen before. They had the look of professionals, well-armed, well paid, the kind of men who solved problems with efficiency rather than theater. Hired guns. Ronin kept his expression neutral, but his mind raced. Hale was escalating. Whatever move he'd been planning, it involved bringing in outside help. Men who wouldn't hesitate, wouldn't question, wouldn't care about anything except completing their contract. This changed the calculation. If Hale had hired guns in play, the timeline wasn't just fast, it was immediate. They'd move tonight or tomorrow, and waiting meant giving them the advantage of choosing when and where the confrontation happened. Ronin needed those books now. He walked back to the stable, forcing himself to move casually while his pulse hammered. Gideon took one look at his face and set down the bridle he'd been mending. What happened? Hale brought in professionals. 3 of them, maybe more. Ronin glanced toward the street. We're out of time. Then maybe you should run? That's what he wants, for me to panic and try to leave town, right into whatever ambush he's got waiting on the road out. Ronin shook his head. No, we stick to the plan, tonight, 1 in the morning. And if those hired guns are waiting for you at the bank, then I'll have to be better than they are. It wasn't much of an answer, but it was the only one he had. The hours between afternoon and midnight crawled by on their bellies like wounded things. Ronin tried to rest, managed maybe an hour of something that resembled sleep. Gideon kept watch, his old Spencer rifle across his knees, a relic from the war but still functional, still deadly in the right hands. At 12:30, Ronin started preparing. He checked his revolver, counted rounds, made sure everything moved smoothly. He left his coat behind, too bulky for what he needed to do, and wore just his vest and shirt. Dark colors. Nothing that would catch light. You want company? Gideon asked. Need you here. If this goes wrong, someone has to tell the story. Ronin met the old man's eyes. And if I don't come back, take Ash and ride. Don't wait. Don't try to help. Just go. That horse won't leave without you. Then convince him. Ronin checked his gun one more time. But don't let Hale get him. That's not negotiable. Gideon nodded slowly. Be careful, son. Careful stopped being an option yesterday. Ronin slipped out the back of the stable into an alley that smelled like garbage and old rain. The night was dark. Crow had been right about the new moon, and quiet in the way frontier towns got quiet when everyone was either asleep or pretending to be. He moved through shadows, keeping to the spaces between buildings where lamplight didn't reach. The bank was 4 blocks away, but he took a route that added another 3 blocks to the distance, doubling back twice to make sure nobody was following. The back alley behind the bank was darker than the rest of Black Hollow, like the town itself had decided not to look too closely at what happened there. Crow was waiting, pressed against the wall near the back door. Thought you might have changed your mind, the sheriff whispered. Still might, Ronin said. Where's Porter? Just started his rounds. We've got maybe 12 minutes before he's back. And the watchers Hale had on me? Told them there was a disturbance at the hotel, sent them to investigate. They'll figure out it was nothing in about 10 minutes, so we need to move fast. Crow produced a key ring, selected one that looked newer than the others. Convinced Porter to let me make a copy last year. Told him it was for emergencies. This count as an emergency? I'd say so. The key turned smoothly, and the door opened onto darkness that smelled like ink and paper and old money. They stepped inside, closing the door behind them. For a moment they stood still, letting their eyes adjust and listening for any sound that suggested they weren't alone. Nothing. Whitmore's desk first, Crow whispered. Get the combination, then we go upstairs. They moved through the main floor like ghosts, navigating by memory and the faint light coming through the front windows. Whitmore's desk sat in an alcove near the teller cages, organized with the obsessive precision of a man who feared chaos more than death. The locked compartment Crow had mentioned was in the bottom right drawer. Ronin pulled out a small tool, something he'd carried for years and used more often than he cared to admit, and worked the lock. It gave with a soft click that sounded thunderous in the silence. Inside the compartment, 3 folders, a small ledger, and a piece of paper folded into quarters. Ronin opened the paper. Numbers. 3 sequences, each labeled with initials. MH, TW, RF, Mercer Hale, Thomas Whitmore. Probably Robert Fletcher. The safe had 3 combination locks, 1 for each key holder. All 3 would need to be opened in sequence for the safe to unlock. Problem. Ronin whispered. What? 3 combinations. We need all 3 to open the safe. Crow cursed quietly. Fletcher's will be at his house. There's no way to get it without... A sound from upstairs froze them both. Footsteps. Someone was in the building. Ronin's hand moved to his gun. Crow looked pale in the dim light, realizing what this meant. Either Porter had cut his round short, or someone else was here. Someone who wasn't supposed to be. The footsteps moved across the floor above them, confident, unhurried. Not the careful steps of a watchman checking for intruders. These were the steps of someone who belonged here, who had every right to be walking around in the middle of the night. Then they heard the voice. I know you're down there, Sheriff. Mercer Hale's voice drifted down from upstairs, conversational and calm. You and Mr. Vale both. Did you really think I wouldn't notice when my sheriff suddenly develops a conscience? Crow's face went gray. Come upstairs, Hale continued. We should discuss this like reasonable men. No need for anyone to get hurt over a misunderstanding. Ronin and Crow looked at each other. Every instinct Ronin had screamed that going upstairs was suicide. But staying down here meant being trapped, cornered, with no way out except through Hale. What do we do? Crow whispered. Ronin thought fast. Hale wouldn't be here alone, not after bringing in hired guns. He'd have backup somewhere close, probably covering the exits, which meant running wasn't an option. Fighting would be 3 against 2 at best, worse odds if there were more men than he'd counted. That left talking. We go up, Ronin said quietly, but carefully, and be ready for this to go bad fast. They moved toward the stairs, every step feeling like a mistake. At the top, lamplight spilled from Hale's office. The door stood open. Inside, Hale sat behind his desk exactly as he had yesterday, except now he held a small pistol that he kept pointed casually in their direction. He wasn't alone. Fletcher stood to his left, wrists still bandaged, looking at Ronin with undisguised hatred. To Hale's right stood one of the hired guns Ronin had seen earlier, a tall man with a scar running from his eye to his jaw, and the kind of stillness that came from knowing exactly how dangerous he was. Gentlemen, Hale said pleasantly, I'm disappointed. Sheriff, I expected better from you. And Mr. Vale, well, he smiled. I expected exactly this. You were waiting for us, Ronin said. Of course. You're not as subtle as you think. The moment Dorian came to warn me that you'd turned him, I knew what you'd try. Ronin's stomach dropped. Dorian told you. Dorian works for me. Always has. Hale's smile widened. Did you really think one of my employees would suddenly develop a conscience? That he'd risk everything to help a stranger? The whole performance was designed to make you do exactly this, break into my bank, where I could deal with you away from witnesses and public scrutiny. Crow made a sound like he'd been punched. Then all of this was a trap. Yes. Hale set the pistol on his desk but kept his hand near it. A rather elaborate one, I admit, but necessary. Mr. Vale here had become a problem that needed solving, and simply having him killed would have raised too many questions. But catching him in the act of robbery? That's different. That's justified. Nobody's going to believe we were robbing you, Ronin said. Won't they? A drifter with a grudge and a sheriff who's been drinking too much and showing signs of instability. Both caught breaking into a bank in the middle of the night? Hale shrugged. The story writes itself. And when my men arrived to stop you and you resisted, well, tragic, but understandable. The hired gun's hand moved toward his weapon. Wait, Ronin said quickly. You're making a mistake. Am I? Enlighten me. You think this is contained. Neat. A problem solved with a convenient explanation. Ronin kept his voice steady, buying time to think. But you're forgetting something. We're not the only ones who know what you've been doing. Who else knows? Gideon? An old man nobody listens to. Dorian, working for me. The townspeople. Hale laughed. They're too terrified or too complicit to say anything. You've got no allies, Mr. Vale. You're alone. Maybe. But you're also forgetting something else. What's that? I'm not afraid of you. The words hung in the air like smoke. Hale's smile faltered slightly, and in that moment, Ronin moved. Not toward Hale. That's what they expected. He dove sideways toward the window, his body already turning as his hand found his gun. The hired gun was fast, faster than Ronin had hoped, but not quite fast enough. Ronin's shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around. Then everything exploded into chaos and gunfire and the sound of glass breaking as Ronin went through the window into the darkness beyond. He hit the ground hard, rolled, came up running. Behind him, more shots. Wild, angry, the sound of men who'd lost control of a situation they thought they owned. Ronin ran toward the one place he knew, the stable, toward Ash, toward Gideon, toward whatever chance he had of surviving the next 10 minutes. Behind him, Black Hollow erupted into a chaos that had been waiting 6 years to arrive. And somewhere in that chaos, the truth about Mercer Hale's empire started coming apart. The alley behind the bank smelled like blood and gunpowder, and Ronin's shoulder screamed where he'd hit the ground wrong. He didn't stop running. Couldn't. Behind him, voices shouted commands and boots hammered against wood as Hale's men poured out of the bank. Ronin cut left into a narrow passage between buildings, then right through someone's yard, scattering chickens that squawked indignation into the night. His lungs burned and his vision blurred at the edges, but he kept moving because stopping meant dying. A shot cracked past his ear, close enough that he felt the air move. They were gaining on him. 3 men at least, maybe more. And they knew this town better than he did. Every shortcut, every dead end, every place where a running man might get trapped. The stable was 2 blocks away. Might as well have been 2 miles. Ronin vaulted a fence, landed badly, stumbled, but kept his feet. Another shot, this one punching into the fence post beside him and spraying splinters. He fired back without aiming, just trying to slow them down, make them cautious. The hammer clicked on an empty chamber. Out of bullets. Perfect. He burst onto Main Street expecting to find it empty, but Black Hollow had woken up. Lamps flickered in windows, doors cracked open. People who'd been pretending to sleep were now pretending to see what the commotion was about, while actually trying to figure out if they needed to hide or run. Ronin sprinted across the street toward the stable. Behind him, Fletcher's voice cut through the chaos. "He's headed for his horse. Cut him off." The stable door stood open. Gideon must have heard the shooting. Ronin dove through the entrance and immediately rolled left, expecting gunfire to follow him inside. It didn't come. They wanted him alive now, alive and captured, so Hale could control the story about what happened tonight. "Gideon!" Ronin called into the darkness. "Here." The old man's voice came from somewhere near Ash's stall. "You hurt?" "Not yet. They're right behind me." "I heard." There was a metallic click, the sound of Gideon cocking his Spencer rifle. "How many?" "Too many." Footsteps outside. Fletcher's voice again, closer now. "Surround it. Don't let him get to the horse." Ronin moved through the darkness toward where Gideon waited. His eyes were adjusting, picking out shapes in the gloom. Ash stood in his stall, ears pinned back, sensing the danger. The horse was already saddled. Gideon had prepared for a fast exit. "What happened in there?" Gideon whispered. "Dorian was working for Hale. Whole thing was a setup." Ronin checked his revolver, started reloading from the bullets in his pocket. His hands shook slightly from adrenaline. "Crow's probably dead. Sheriff made his choice. He made it because I convinced him to." "That guilt help you right now?" "No." "Then set it down and pick it up later." Gideon shifted position. "We've got maybe 30 seconds before they come through that door." "What's the play?" Ronin finished loading, snapped the cylinder shut. "I run. You stay. Tell them you didn't know what I was doing, that I forced you to saddle the horse." "That's a terrible plan." "It's the only one that keeps you alive. I'm 73 years old. Staying alive stopped being my primary concern around the time my knees started hurting." Gideon's voice was steady. "Besides, I've watched bad men do bad things in this town for too long. If I'm going to die, rather it be while doing something that matters." Before Ronin could argue, the stable doors crashed open. Lamplight flooded in, silhouetting 3 figures. Fletcher stood in the center, flanked by 2 of Hale's hired guns. The collections agent's face was twisted with rage and satisfaction. "It's over, Vale. Come out and maybe you live long enough to see a trial." "Trials in Black Hollow seem to have predetermined outcomes," Ronin called back. "Think I'll take my chances out here. You're trapped. No way out except through us. And my men have orders to shoot if you try anything stupid." Fletcher took a step inside. "Make this easy. Put down your weapon and step out where we can see you." Ronin looked at Gideon. The old man gave a slight nod, then raised his voice. Fletcher, you worthless piece of... The Spencer rifle cracked like thunder in the enclosed space. The shot went high, deliberate, hitting the beam above Fletcher's head and raining splinters down on the men in the doorway. They scattered, diving for cover, and in that instant of confusion, Ronin moved. He grabbed Ash's reins and vaulted into the saddle. The horse needed no encouragement. It lunged forward, heading not for the main door where Fletcher's men were recovering, but toward the back where a smaller door led to the rear alley. More gunfire. Something tugged at Ronin's vest but didn't penetrate. Then they were through the back door and into the alley, Ash's hooves striking sparks from the hard-packed dirt. Behind them, Gideon's rifle fired again. Then silence. Ronin wanted to go back, wanted to make sure the old man was alive, but going back meant capture, and capture meant whatever story Hale wanted to tell would be the only story anyone heard. So he rode, hating himself for it, promising Gideon's memory that he'd make it count. The alley opened onto a side street. Ronin guided Ash right, then left, then through someone's garden and over a low wall, putting distance and obstacles between himself and pursuit. The town was fully awake now, people shouting, someone ringing a bell, the whole place transforming from sleepy settlement into angry hornet's nest. He needed to get out of Black Hollow, needed to reach the territorial capital, find a federal marshal, someone who couldn't be bought. But leaving meant abandoning any evidence, any proof of what Hale had done. It meant Crow and Gideon would have died for nothing. Unless. The thought hit him as Ash jumped another fence. Ronin had failed to get Hale's private ledgers, but that wasn't the only evidence. The bank's public records, the ones Hale showed to officials and territorial auditors, those existed too. And while they might look legitimate on their surface, they'd still show patterns, loans that all went to outsiders, collections that happened too quickly, too efficiently, payments that didn't quite add up if someone knew how to look. More importantly, there'd be names. All the people Hale had targeted over the years, some might be dead, gone, or too scared to talk, but some might be willing to testify if they knew someone was finally standing up to him. But getting those records meant going back into town, back toward the men hunting him, back into the trap he'd barely escaped. Ronin pulled Ash to a stop in the shadows behind a church at the edge of Black Hollow. The horse was breathing hard, but not winded. They'd ridden harder before, and they'd ride harder again before this night was over. "I know," Ronin said quietly, patting Ash's neck. "This is a terrible idea, but we're committed now." Ash snorted, which could have meant agreement or resignation. Ronin sat still, listening to Black Hollow chase itself in circles. Most of the noise was concentrated near the stable and the bank. That's where they expected him to be. The rest of the town was waking up confused, not sure what was happening or who to believe. That confusion was a weapon if he used it right. He guided Ash through the back streets, moving toward a building he'd noticed earlier but hadn't paid much attention to, the land office. It was connected to Hale's operation, Crow had mentioned that, which meant it would have records of every property seizure, every foreclosure, every piece of land that had changed hands under questionable circumstances. The building was dark, single-story, with a door that looked like it would open if you breathed on it wrong. Ronin tied Ash to a post where he could reach him quickly, then approached the door. No lock, just a latch. He lifted it and stepped inside. The interior smelled like dust and neglect. Ronin risked lighting a match, shielding the flame with his hand. Shelves lined the walls, packed with ledgers and deed books and survey maps. He grabbed the most recent ledger, flipped it open. Names, dates, property descriptions. And next to each entry, the reason for transfer. Debt satisfaction. Loan default. Foreclosure proceedings. Ronin worked fast, pulling down ledgers from the past 5 years and stacking them near the door. He couldn't read them all now, but he could take them, hide them somewhere Hale couldn't reach, get them to someone who had the authority and inclination to investigate. He was on his 4th ledger when he heard the footsteps outside. Ronin froze, the match burning down toward his fingers. He blew it out and pressed himself against the wall beside the door, his gun in his hand. The door opened slowly. A figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the ambient light from the street. "Mr. Vale?" The voice was hesitant, frightened. "Are you in here?" Not Fletcher, not one of the hired guns. Ronin recognized the voice after a second. "Dorian?" "Yes." The collections agent moved further inside. "Please don't shoot me. Give me one reason why not. You sold me out to Hale. I didn't have a choice, Dorian's voice cracked. He knew I'd talked to you. Someone saw us, told him. He said if I didn't help set the trap, he'd kill my family. My wife and daughter. They live on a farm outside town. He sent men there this afternoon to make sure I understood. Ronin didn't lower the gun. So you led us into an ambush. I led you into a trap that you survived. That counts for something. Not much. I know. Dorian took a shaky breath. But I'm here now, and I brought something. He held up a small leather-bound book. The real ledger, the one from Hale's safe. I took it while everyone was chasing you. Ronin stared at the book. Why? Because you were right, about all of it, and because if I don't do something now, I'll be the kind of man who can't live with himself much longer. Dorian set the book on the nearest shelf. I'm leaving, taking my family and running while Hale's distracted. I don't know where we'll go, but anywhere's better than here. He'll come after you. Probably, but at least I'll be running from him instead of working for him. Dorian moved toward the door. The ledger's yours. Do something with it. Make this worth what it cost. Wait. Ronin lowered his gun. The sheriff, Crow. What happened to him? Dorian's silhouette sagged. I'm sorry. Fletcher shot him when he tried to run. Said it was justified, criminal attempting to escape custody. Nobody's going to question it. The words hit harder than Ronin expected. He'd known it was likely, but knowing and hearing were different things. Crow had died trying to be the man he'd stopped being 20 years ago. Maybe that counted for something, maybe it didn't. Either way, he was dead. And Gideon? Alive, last I saw. They arrested him for aiding a fugitive. Hale wants him as leverage, thinks you'll try to trade yourself for his release. He's right. Don't. Dorian's voice was urgent. That's what he wants. He gets you. He gets control of the story, and everything goes back to how it was. The only way you win is by getting that ledger to someone who can actually do something with it. Who? The territorial judge is Hale's brother-in-law. The land office works for him. Even if I reach the capital, who's going to believe a drifter accused of robbery over a respected banker with documentation? I don't know, Dorian admitted, but it's better than nothing. He slipped out before Ronin could respond, disappearing into the night like a man who'd already spent too long being visible. Ronin stood alone in the darkness, surrounded by evidence of other people's stolen lives. He picked up the leather book Dorian had left. Even in the darkness, it felt important, heavier than its physical weight suggested. He tucked it inside his vest along with the land office ledgers, then moved toward the door. Outside, the sounds of pursuit had changed, more organized now. Hale had regrouped his men, probably realized that Ronin wasn't just running blindly. They'd start checking likely targets, the stable again, the sheriff's office, anywhere he might look for evidence or help, which meant staying in Black Hollow was suicide. Ronin untied Ash and mounted. The horse sensed his urgency, dancing sideways, ready to run, but Ronin didn't head for the edge of town. Not yet. There was one more place he needed to hit, one more piece of evidence that might make the difference between a story people believed and a story they dismissed. The general store where the frightened woman had taken his money stood dark and locked. Ronin dismounted, tried the door. Solid. The windows were barred, unusual for a general store, but not surprising in a town where Hale owned the merchandise inside along with the debt that kept the storekeeper working. Ronin looked around for something to break the lock. He found a piece of iron pipe in the alley, probably left over from some repair work that got abandoned. 3 solid strikes, and the lock gave way with a crack that sounded thunderous. He pushed inside. Used another match to light a lamp behind the counter, keeping the flame low. Then he started searching. Store records should be simple. Goods purchased, goods sold, accounts receivable. But in Black Hollow, nothing was simple. Ronin found the ledger behind the counter, opened it. The storekeeper, her name was Margaret Finch, according to the first page, hadn't just been recording sales. She'd been documenting every interaction with Hale's bank. Loan payments that increased without explanation. Inventory costs that didn't match actual merchandise. Late fees that appeared even when payments came on time. And in the margins, in handwriting so small Ronin had to hold the page close to the lamp, she'd written notes. Names of other business owners who'd faced similar problems. Dates when Hale's men had visited with adjustments to their accounts. quiet acts of rebellion by a woman who couldn't fight openly but refused to stay completely silent. Ronin added her ledger to his collection. Then he spotted something else, a wooden box under the counter, locked but flimsy. He broke it open. Inside, letters, dozens of them, all addressed to territorial officials, federal marshals, even a senator, all describing what Hale was doing in Black Hollow, all unsent. Margaret Finch had been writing for help for years and never mailed a single letter, probably because Hale controlled the post office too, and sending them would have been suicide. But she'd kept writing them anyway, creating a record, a testimony, a paper trail of evidence that might matter if it ever reached the right people. Ronin took the entire box. He was stuffing it into his saddlebag when he heard the voice from the doorway. "Step away from the horse, Vale." Fletcher stood in the entrance, his pistol aimed steady despite his bandaged wrist. Behind him, 2 more men blocked the street. No way out except through them. "You've caused more trouble than you're worth," Fletcher continued. "Hale wanted you alive, but I think we can make a good case for self-defense. You were looting a store. We tried to stop you. Things went bad. You gonna shoot me in the back? That's your style? I'm gonna shoot you wherever I need to shoot you. Then I'm going to enjoy watching your horse get sold at auction to cover your debts." Fletcher's smile was ugly. "Maybe I'll buy him myself, take him out every day and remind him what happened to his owner." Ronin's hand moved toward his gun. Fletcher tensed, his finger tightening on the trigger. For a frozen second, both men calculated angles and odds, and the probability of dying in a general store over a box of letters nobody would read. Then the window behind Fletcher exploded inward. Glass shattered. Fletcher spun around, confused. One of the men behind him shouted something. Then the street erupted into chaos as someone opened fire from the buildings across the way. Not at Ronin, at Fletcher's men. Ronin didn't waste the opportunity. He grabbed Ash's reins, vaulted into the saddle, and drove his heels into the horse's flanks. Ash lunged forward. Fletcher tried to get clear but wasn't quite fast enough. The horse's shoulder caught him and sent him sprawling. Then they were running, leaving Fletcher cursing in the dirt and the sound of continued gunfire behind them. Ronin didn't know who'd created the distraction, didn't have time to care. He rode hard toward the edge of Black Hollow, the evidence weighing heavy in his saddlebags. Every hoofbeat carrying him closer to whatever came next. Behind him, the town he'd entered 2 days ago looking for water and peace continued tearing itself apart. Ahead lay open territory, darkness, and the faint possibility that maybe he'd grabbed enough truth to make a difference. At the town limits, Ronin pulled Ash to a stop and looked back. Black Hollow burned in patches where lamps had been knocked over during the chaos. Smoke rose into the night sky. People ran through streets that had learned to stay quiet, suddenly remembering that they outnumbered Hale's men if they decided to stop being afraid. Ronin thought about Crow, dead in a bank he'd spent 20 years helping corrupt. About Gideon, arrested for the crime of standing with someone who needed standing with. About Margaret Finch, writing letters she never sent because hope looked different when you were trapped. Then he turned Ash away from Black Hollow and rode into the darkness, carrying their stories with him, determined that if nothing else, someone would hear what they'd tried to say. The territorial capital was 3 days hard riding. Ronin gave himself 2. The first night out of Black Hollow, Ronin didn't sleep at all. He kept Ash moving at a pace that 8 miles but wouldn't break the horse, stopping only when absolutely necessary to let the animal drink and catch his breath. Every sound in the darkness felt like pursuit. The snap of a branch, the call of a night bird, the whisper of wind through dry grass. His nerves were wire-tight, and his mind wouldn't stop replaying the moment Crow fell, the sound of Gideon's rifle going silent. Fletcher's face twisted with rage. Around dawn, Ronin finally allowed himself to stop at a creek that ran clear and cold between 2 hills. Ash drank deeply while Ronin splashed water on his face, trying to wash away exhaustion that went deeper than lack of sleep. His shoulder throbbed where he'd hit the ground jumping through the window, and his ribs ached from where something, a bullet or debris, he couldn't remember, had struck his vest. He pulled out the leather-bound ledger Dorian had given him and opened it properly for the first time. The morning light was thin and gray, but good enough to read by. The entries were meticulous. Hale hadn't just been careless. He documented everything because he'd never believed anyone would see these pages. Each loan listed the real amount borrowed, the fabricated amount claimed, and the difference. Each collection showed what was actually owed versus what was taken. Names jumped out at Ronin. People he'd never met but whose lives were reduced to numbers and dates, and the clinical notation, full seizure, no recovery possible. Margaret Finch appeared on page 7. Original loan, $40 to repair her store after a fire. Amount claimed in default, $320. Property seized, entire inventory plus building deed. Current status, indentured management under bank supervision. Ronin had known it was bad. Reading it was different. Each page represented a family destroyed, a life dismantled, dreams turned into debt, and debt into despair. 16 names in 5 years. That was just the major seizures. The ledger didn't count the smaller extractions, the monthly bleeding of people who were paying but never getting clear. He closed the book carefully and tucked it back in his vest. The evidence was damning, but evidence only mattered if it reached someone who could act on it. And between here and the territorial capital lay 2 days of open ground where Hale's reach might extend further than Ronin knew. The second day was harder than the first. Ash was tired and Ronin was operating on coffee and determination, neither of which lasted as long as they needed to. Around noon, he spotted riders on the horizon behind him. 3 of them, moving fast. Could be innocent travelers. Could be Hale's hired guns. Ronin didn't wait to find out. He pushed Ash into a canyon system he'd been paralleling, using the broken terrain to break line of sight. The riders followed. Definitely not innocent. The chase lasted 2 hours through rocks and scrub brush, and narrow passages where one wrong step would send horse and rider tumbling. Ronin had the advantage of a better horse and desperation. The pursuers had the advantage of numbers and fresh mounts. It balanced out into a grinding contest of endurance and nerve. Finally, Ronin found what he needed, a split in the canyon where one path led deeper into the maze and another doubled back toward open ground. He took the doubling back route, then dismounted and used his hat to sweep away Ash's tracks at the split. It was crude. Wouldn't fool anyone who looked carefully, but it might buy him 10 minutes. He remounted and rode hard for the canyon mouth. Behind him, he heard the pursuers reach the split. Voices called out, arguing about which way to go. Then silence as they made their choice. Ronin emerged from the canyon and immediately angled northwest, away from the direct route to the capital. If they'd taken the wrong path, it would be hours before they realized their mistake. If they'd taken the right path, the changed direction might confuse them enough to gain more distance. He didn't see them again that day, but he felt their presence like pressure against his back. Hale wouldn't give up. The banker had too much to lose, and men with empires to protect tended to throw resources at problems until the problems went away or the resources ran out. That night, Ronin made a cold camp in a draw that hid the light of any fire he might have considered building. He didn't consider one. He ate hardtack and drank water and checked Ash for injuries. The horse was holding up better than he had any right to expect, but another day at this pace would break him, which meant Ronin had a choice: slow down and risk capture, or push through and risk killing the only living thing in the territory he trusted. He chose a third option. Around midnight, he saddled Ash and rode not toward the capital, but toward a settlement called Copper Ridge that sat 12 miles off his planned route. It was a mining town, rough and temporary, the kind of place where people asked few questions and minded their business because everyone had something they didn't want examined too closely. More importantly, it had a telegraph office. Ronin reached Copper Ridge just before dawn. The town was still mostly asleep, though smoke already rose from the smelter at the edge of the settlement. He found the telegraph office, a shack attached to the general store, and knocked until someone answered. The operator was a thin man in his 50s who looked at Ronin's dust-covered clothes and exhausted horse and made immediate assumptions about the nature of his business. "We don't send messages for fugitives." "Good thing I'm not a fugitive then," Ronin said. He pulled out money, more than the telegram would cost. "I need to send a message to the territorial marshal's office. It's urgent." The operator looked at the money, then at Ronin's face. Whatever he saw there made him reconsider his initial judgment. "What's the message?" Ronin had been composing it in his head for the last 6 hours. To Federal Marshal James Hendricks, Territorial Capital. Evidence of systematic fraud and corruption in Black Hollow under banker Mercer Hale. Multiple victims over 5 years. Have documentation. Request immediate investigation and protection for witnesses. Will arrive capital within 2 days with full evidence. Signed, Ronin Vale. The operator wrote it down, his hand moving faster as he realized this wasn't some domestic dispute or claim-jumping accusation. "This is serious." Very. Hale's got friends, powerful ones. I know. Sending this makes me part of whatever this is. Ronin added more money to the pile on the counter. Sending this makes you the man who helped stop it. That's worth something. The operator looked at the money, at the message, at Ronin. Then he nodded once and moved to his equipment. The telegraph key started clicking, sending Ronin's words across the wires toward the capital and whoever might be listening. When it was done, the operator looked up. Sent. You want to wait for a reply? Can't, but if anyone comes asking about me. I don't remember you. Never saw you. Didn't send anything. The operator swept the money off the counter. But for what it's worth, I hope you make it. Hale's type. They need stopping. Ronin left Copper Ridge as the sun cracked the horizon, feeling marginally better about his chances. If the message reached Hendricks, if the marshal was honest, if Hale's influence didn't extend into the capital's federal offices. Too many ifs, but they were better than nothing. The rest of that day passed in a blur of miles and exhaustion. Ronin let Ash set the pace, trusting the horses' instincts about how fast they could move without braking. They stopped more frequently, rested longer. The urgency was still there, but Ronin had done what he could to prepare the ground. Now he just needed to arrive alive. On the evening of the second day, he spotted the territorial capital on the horizon. It wasn't much as capitals went, maybe 3,000 people, a handful of permanent buildings, enough infrastructure to support territorial government, but not enough to suggest permanence. Everyone knew that when this became a state, the capital would move somewhere more central, more developed, more worthy of the title. For now, it was just the place where territorial law theoretically meant something. Ronin rode in slowly, letting Ash cool down, taking stock of his surroundings. The town had the organized chaos of government, clerks hurrying between buildings with papers, lawyers arguing on street corners, politicians making promises they had no intention of keeping. It was corrupt in its own way, but it was a different kind of corruption than Black Hollow's. Here, you had to work harder to buy influence, had to be more subtle about it. That subtlety might be enough to matter. The marshal's office occupied a stone building near the territorial courthouse. Ronin tied Ash outside, pulled the saddlebags containing his evidence over his shoulder, and walked in. The clerk at the front desk looked up with the expression of someone who'd seen too many people with grievances and not enough people with solutions. Help you? I need to see Marshal Hendricks. I sent a telegram yesterday. Name? Ronin Vale. The clerk's expression shifted. Surprise, maybe concern. Wait here. He disappeared through a door behind the desk. Ronin stood in the small waiting area, acutely aware of how he must look. Trail-worn, dirty, probably dangerous-looking enough that the clerk had gone to fetch help rather than just announcing him. The door opened. The man who emerged wasn't what Ronin expected. Federal Marshal James Hendricks was maybe 35, well-dressed but not fancy, with eyes that suggested he'd seen enough of human nature to be disappointed, but not enough to stop caring. He looked at Ronin for a long moment, clearly comparing what he saw to whatever he'd imagined when the telegram arrived. Mr. Vale, you look like you rode hard. I did. Come with me. Hendricks led him into a private office, gestured to a chair. Ronin sat, setting the saddlebags on the desk between them. The marshal remained standing, his posture suggesting caution rather than hostility. Your telegram made serious accusations. I've got serious evidence. Before we get to that, I need to know who you are. Really? Hendricks crossed his arms. I did some checking after your message arrived. Ronin Vale doesn't exist, at least not in any official capacity I can find. No military service, no property records, no criminal record. You're a ghost. I prefer to keep a low profile. Men who keep low profiles usually have reasons. Good reasons or bad reasons, but reasons. Hendricks's eyes were sharp. Which kind do you have? Ronin considered how much truth to offer. Too little, and Hendricks wouldn't trust him. Too much, and he'd become a suspect rather than a witness. 6 years ago, I killed a man who deserved killing. Did it in a way that wouldn't look like self-defense to a court, so I didn't stick around to explain. Been moving since then, staying ahead of anyone who might recognize the name I used to use. And you came here because? Because what's happening in Black Hollow is bigger than my past. And because sometimes you have to stop running and start standing. Hendricks studied him for another moment, then sat down. Show me what you've got. Ronin opened the saddlebags and started laying out evidence. The private ledger from Hale's safe, the land office records, Margaret Finch's unsent letters, the public bank records he'd grabbed that showed patterns if you knew how to look. Each piece went onto the desk while Hendricks watched in silence. When everything was displayed, the marshal picked up the private ledger and started reading. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture did, a tightening, a focus that suggested the words on the page were hitting the way Ronin needed them to hit. Minutes passed. Hendricks set down the private ledger and picked up one of Margaret Finch's letters, read it through, then selected another. Finally, he looked up. This is damning, if it's real. It's real. Hale will claim forgery. He'll have lawyers, documentation, witnesses who'll swear these books are fabrications. Hendricks tapped the ledger. And he's got the territorial judge's family. That's going to complicate things. I know. That's why I need federal involvement. Someone who can't be bought. Everyone can be bought, Mr. Vale. It's just a question of price. Hendricks stood, moved to the window. But I'll admit I'm expensive, and I don't like what I'm seeing here. If half of what you're showing me is accurate, Hale's been running a criminal enterprise under the guise of legitimate banking. It's all accurate, every word. You understand what you're asking for. A federal investigation into a territorial matter will cause problems. Hale's connections go beyond Black Hollow. People who benefit from his operation, who've looked the other way because it was profitable or convenient. Hendricks turned back from the window. Going after him means going after a system. Systems fight back. I'm aware. Are you? Because from where I'm standing, you look like a man who rode into something bigger than he expected and now can't ride back out. Hendricks's voice wasn't unkind, just factual. The best outcome here is that I investigate, find corroboration, and build a case strong enough to prosecute despite Hale's connections. That takes months, maybe years, during which time you'll be a target. Every hired gun, every corrupt official, every person who benefits from Hale's operation, they'll all want you dead or discredited. Bolting. What's the worst outcome? I investigate, find that Hale's connections run deeper than suspected, and the whole thing gets buried. You end up in a cell on fabricated charges or dead in an alley with no witnesses. Either way, nothing changes except you're gone. Ronin had expected something like this, the reality of bureaucracy smashing against the urgency of justice. He'd hoped for better, but planned for worse. There's a man in Black Hollow, Gideon Pike. They arrested him for helping me. If I don't do anything, he dies in a cell because he chose to stand with someone who needed it. Noble. But that's not my jurisdiction. Make it your jurisdiction. Ronin's voice was flat. You're a federal marshal. You've got authority that transcends territorial boundaries when federal crimes are involved. Wire fraud. If Hale used telegraphs to facilitate his scheme. Interstate crime if any of his victims came from other territories. Hell, I'll bet some of that money got moved through federal banks at some point. Hendricks looked at him with something approaching respect. You've thought about this. I had 2 days of writing to think about it. The marshal moved back to his desk, looked at the evidence spread across it. His hand hovered over the private ledger, then moved to Margaret Finch's letters. He picked one up, read it again. She never sent these. She was afraid. Everyone in that town is afraid. Fear's a powerful control mechanism. Hale understood that. Hendricks set the letter down carefully. All right. I'll open an investigation, but I need you to understand something, Mr. Vale. The moment I do this, you become an official witness. That means you can't leave the territory, can't disappear, can't do anything except sit still and hope Hale's reach isn't long enough to find you while I build a case. I'm not running anymore. Easy to say now, harder to maintain when people start dying. Hendricks saw Ronin's expression and nodded. Yes, people will die. That's what happens when you threaten someone's empire. Witnesses disappear. Evidence burns. Convenient accidents happen to inconvenient people. Then we'd better work fast. Hendricks almost smiled. Fast isn't how federal investigations work, but I'll do what I can. He stood, extended his hand. In the meantime, you need to stay somewhere safe, somewhere Hale's people won't look for you. They shook. Hendricks's grip was firm, his eyes direct. Whatever calculations he'd been making had come down in Ronin's favor, at least for now. There's a boarding house 3 blocks from here. The woman who runs it is my aunt. She'll keep you alive and quiet while I work. Hendricks started gathering the evidence. But I need you to accept that this might take time, and that the outcome might not be what you're hoping for. What am I hoping for? Justice? Revenge? Closure? Whatever word you're using. Hendricks locked the evidence in a safe behind his desk. The system doesn't deliver those things reliably. It delivers process, procedure, and sometimes, if you're lucky, accountability. But luck's a thin thing to build hope on. It's what I've got. Then we'll make it work. Hendricks walked Ronin to the boarding house, introduced him to a woman named Martha, who looked at her nephew with obvious affection and at Ronin with obvious suspicion. She agreed to provide a room with minimal questions, which suggested she'd done this before for other people who needed hiding. Ronin settled into a small room on the 2nd floor that overlooked an alley where nothing interesting ever happened. He cleaned his gun, checked his ammunition, and tried to sleep. It didn't come easily. His mind kept circling back to Black Hollow, to Gideon sitting in a cell, to Hale calculating his next move. 3 days passed. Hendricks visited twice, updating Ronin on progress that felt glacial. He'd sent requests for information to other territorial offices. He'd started interviewing people who'd had dealings with Hale's bank. He'd filed preliminary paperwork that would allow federal intervention if he found sufficient cause. Everything was proper, legal, slow. On the 4th day, everything changed. Hendricks arrived at the boarding house looking grim. He closed the door to Ronin's room and spoke without preamble. Hale moved, filed an injunction with the territorial judge, his brother-in-law, demanding that all evidence related to his banking practices be secured in Black Hollow pending judicial review. Claims you stole private documents, that they're inadmissible, that any investigation based on them is fruit of a poisoned tree. Ronin felt his stomach drop. Can he do that? He just did. The judge signed the order this morning. Technically, it means I have to return all evidence to Black Hollow and halt my investigation until the territorial court rules on the validity of the documents. That's insane. He's the one being investigated. He can and did. That's how the system works when you own the judges. Hendricks sat heavily on the room's single chair. I'm trying to fight it, but my authority only extends so far. If the territorial court rules against me, I either comply or get removed from my position for overreach. So Hale wins. Maybe. Probably. Hendricks rubbed his face. But there's a window. The injunction requires me to secure the evidence in Black Hollow within 7 days. That gives me a week to copy everything, to gather corroborating testimony, to build a parallel case that doesn't rely solely on the documents you brought. A week isn't enough. No, it's not. Hendricks looked at Ronin. Which is why I need you to do something that's technically illegal but morally necessary. I'm listening. Tonight, you and I are going to copy every page of that ledger by hand. All of Margaret Finch's letters, all the land office records, everything. We'll work through the night if we have to. Then I'm going to send the originals back to Black Hollow as ordered, and I'm going to keep working with the copies while preparing for the legal fight over whether they're admissible. And if the court rules they're not, then we pray that the testimony I've gathered is strong enough to stand on its own. Hendricks stood. But first we have to preserve the information, because once those documents go back to Black Hollow, they'll disappear. Hale will burn them, destroy them, erase any evidence that they ever existed. Ronin stood as well. When do we start? Now. I've got paper, ink, and enough coffee to keep us conscious until dawn. Hendricks moved toward the door. This is your last chance to walk away. Once we start copying those documents, you're committed. No running, no changing your mind. You're in this until it ends, whatever that ending looks like. I was committed the moment I didn't ride out of Black Hollow on the first day, Ronin said. Let's get to work. They worked through the night in Hendricks' office, copying page after page while the territorial capital slept around them. Ronin's hand cramped, his eyes burned, and his exhaustion went so deep he felt like he was moving underwater. But he kept writing, kept transcribing, kept preserving the evidence that 16 people's lives had been stolen and documented by a man arrogant enough to believe his records would never be seen. Hendricks worked across from him, his handwriting faster but no less careful. Neither man spoke, except to confirm numbers or verify names. The only sounds were scratching pens and turning pages, and occasionally the distant sound of someone walking past outside. By dawn, they'd copied everything. 2 complete sets of documentation, identical to the originals in every detail except that these pages were fresh and the ink was still drying. Hendricks locked one set in his safe. The other he gave to Ronin. Hide these, somewhere even I don't know about. If something happens to me, if the official copies disappear, these are the only record left. The marshal's face was haggard with exhaustion. You're the insurance policy now, the thing that keeps this from being completely buried. Ronin took the papers carefully, understanding the weight of what was being handed to him. What happens next? I return the originals to Black Hollow as ordered. Then I keep investigating, keep building a case, keep pushing until either Hale breaks or the system does. Hendricks moved to the window, watched the sun rise over the territorial capital. And you stay alive, because if you die, the backup dies with you. Hale's going to come for me. Without question, which is why you're not staying in the capital. Hendricks pulled an envelope from his desk. Stage leaves at noon for Silverton. It's 3 territories over, far enough that Hale's influence doesn't reach. You'll stay there under a different name until I send word that it's safe to come back. And Gideon? What happens to him while I'm hiding? Hendricks was quiet for a moment. I'm doing what I can. But realistically, Hale's going to use him as leverage. He'll send word through channels that he'll release Pike if you turn yourself in. And you're going to have to decide whether one old man's life is worth the chance of bringing down an entire corrupt system. That's not a fair choice. No, Hendricks agreed. But it's the choice you've got. Ronin stood at the window of that boarding house room, watching the morning light spread across a town that looked peaceful and orderly, and nothing like the chaos he'd left behind in Black Hollow. The copied document sat heavy in his hands, a paperweight of other people's suffering, and he wondered if any of this would matter in the end. But wondering didn't change what needed doing. So he packed the documents carefully, prepared to board a stage for Silverton, and tried not to think about Gideon sitting in a cell, wondering if the man he'd helped would come back for him. Ronin never made it to Silverton. He got as far as the stage office, watched his ticket get stamped, saw his bag get loaded onto the coach. Then he stood there on the platform while other passengers climbed aboard and realized he couldn't do it. Couldn't run while Gideon sat in a cell. Couldn't hide while Hendricks fought alone against a system designed to protect men like Hale. Couldn't spend however many weeks or months it took waiting for word that might never come. Running had kept him alive for 6 years. It had also kept him empty. He retrieved his bag before the stage left, ignoring the driver's confusion and the clerk's irritation. Walked back through the territorial capital's streets with no plan except the knowledge that plans built on hiding had stopped making sense somewhere between Black Hollow and here. Hendricks found him 2 hours later at the boarding house, sitting on the front steps like a man who'd run out of places to go. You were supposed to be on that stage. I know. Hale's people will be looking for you here, probably already are. Hendricks sat down beside him, not angry, just tired. You're making my job harder. Sorry. No, you're not. The marshal pulled out a cigarette, lit it, offered one to Ronin. They smoked in silence for a minute, watching people go about their ordinary lives, shopping, arguing, courting, conducting the small businesses of existence that continued whether empires rose or fell. I can't do it, Ronin said finally. Can't run while good people suffer for helping me. I've spent 6 years running from one thing or another, and all it's done is guarantee I never finish anything, never fix anything, never actually stand for something long enough to see if standing matters. Standing gets you killed. Maybe, but running just gets you tired. Ronin exhaled smoke toward the sky. Gideon stood with me when he didn't have to. Crow died trying to be better than what he'd become. Even Margaret Finch, writing those letters she never sent, she was standing in the only way she could. And I'm supposed to hide in Silverton while they pay for decisions I set in motion? Hendricks was quiet for a long time. You know what you're really saying? You're saying one man's pride is worth more than the chance of justice for 16 victims. That's not. It is exactly that. You stay here, you become a target. Hale sends his guns, someone dies, probably you. And when you die, the backup documentation dies with you. And all those people whose lives are in those ledgers, they get nothing. No justice, no restitution, nothing except the satisfaction of knowing Ronin Vale felt too guilty to run away. The words hit like fists, each one landing where Ronin couldn't dodge. He wanted to argue, to say it wasn't about pride. But Hendricks wasn't wrong. There was ego in the decision to stay, a need to be present for the ending, to see his actions through to their conclusion, regardless of whether that served the larger purpose. "So what do you want me to do?" Ronin asked. "Run and spend every day wondering if I abandoned people who needed me? Hide in hope that somehow justice gets served without me having to risk anything? I've tried that. It doesn't work. What works is patience, strategy, building cases that survive longer than the people who started them." Hendricks ground out his cigarette. "But I can't make you be patient, and I can't protect you if you won't protect yourself. So here's what happens next. You stay in the capital, you stay at this boarding house, and you stay out of sight. I do my job. When the territorial court makes its ruling about the evidence, we respond accordingly. If things go bad, you run then. If they go well, you testify when called. Either way, you stop making decisions based on how you feel about yourself and start making them based on what actually helps. And Gideon is being used as bait. Hale wants you to trade yourself for him. The moment you do, both of you die and the evidence becomes irrelevant because there's no witness to authenticate it." Hendricks stood. "So the best thing you can do for Gideon Pike is stay alive and let me work. That's not running. That's strategy." Ronin sat there after Hendricks left, turning the marshal's words over in his mind. The man wasn't wrong. Staying in the capital was smarter than going back to Black Hollow. But smart and right weren't always the same thing, and Ronin had spent enough years being smart to know it didn't fill the hollow places inside. 3 more days crawled past. Hendricks sent the original documents back to Black Hollow as ordered, and immediately filed motions arguing that copies should be admissible even if originals were destroyed. The territorial judge, Hale's brother-in-law, scheduled a hearing for 2 weeks out, which everyone understood was designed to give Hale time to eliminate problems and solidify his position. During those 3 days, Ronin learned things he wished he didn't know. A witness Hendricks had been cultivating, a former employee of Hale's bank willing to testify about doctored records, disappeared. Just didn't show up for a scheduled meeting, and when Hendricks went to his home, the place was empty. Cleared out like the man had never existed. Another potential witness, one of the victims listed in Hale's ledger, suddenly recanted his story. Said he'd been mistaken, that the bank had treated him fairly, that he had no complaints. Hendricks showed Ronin the new statement, and even on paper you could feel the fear radiating from the words. "He's cleaning up," Hendricks said, "removing anyone who might corroborate what's in those ledgers. By the time we get to trial, if we get to trial, it'll be our copies against his word, with no witnesses willing to risk supporting us." "What about Margaret Finch?" "Can't find her. Store's closed. House is empty. Either she ran or Hale got to her." The marshal looked older than he had a week ago. "This is how it works, Vale. People talk about justice like it's inevitable, like truth always wins. But truth only wins when enough people are brave enough to speak it, and Hale's very good at making sure people choose silence over bravery." On the 4th day, a message arrived that changed everything. Hendricks came to the boarding house at dawn, looking like he hadn't slept. He had a telegram in his hand and an expression Ronin couldn't read. What happened? "Gideon Pike is being released. Hale dropped all charges, issued a public statement saying the arrest was based on misunderstanding, offered compensation for wrongful detention." Hendricks handed over the telegram. "It doesn't make sense. Hale needs leverage. Releasing his only bargaining chip means he doesn't need leverage anymore because he's already won," Ronin finished. He read the telegram twice, trying to find the trap in words that seemed straightforward. Or he wants us to think he's won. Either way, Pike's free. Stage arrives from Black Hollow this afternoon. He'll be on it. Ronin was waiting at the stage office when it pulled in. Gideon climbed down carefully, moving like every joint hurt, but alive. His eyes found Ronin immediately, and something passed between them that didn't need words. They walked back to the boarding house in silence. Martha took one look at Gideon and immediately started heating water for a bath and preparing food. The old man submitted to her care with the weary gratitude of someone who'd stopped expecting kindness. When he was cleaned up and fed, they sat in Ronin's room while evening settled over the capital. "You should have run," Gideon said finally. People keep telling me that. Because it's true. What you did, breaking into that bank, stealing those records. It doesn't matter if you're not alive to see justice done. Did they hurt you? Nothing permanent. Hale's smarter than that. He kept me comfortable, well-fed, treated like a guest who wasn't allowed to leave, made sure I understood I was valuable alive and worthless dead. Gideon's hands shook slightly as he lifted his coffee cup. Then yesterday, Fletcher came to my cell, said Hale was releasing me as a gesture of good faith, that the territorial judge had reviewed the situation and determined the investigation was based on stolen documents and false accusations. Case closed, everyone goes home. You believe that? Not for a second. Hale doesn't make gestures of good faith. He makes calculations. Gideon set down the cup. He let me go because keeping me didn't serve his purpose anymore, which means either he's already won or he's setting up something worse. That night, Ronin couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Hale's next move, about what calculation would lead a man to release his leverage. Around midnight, he gave up on rest and went downstairs, thinking maybe coffee and futile planning would be better than lying awake. Hendricks was already in the kitchen, sitting at Martha's table with papers spread around him. "Can't sleep either?" Ronin asked. "Sleep's for people who aren't watching their cases fall apart." The marshal gestured to the papers. "Look at this. Every witness I'd lined up, gone or recanted, every corroborating piece of evidence I'd requested from other offices, delayed or denied. Every avenue I try to pursue runs into a wall built by someone who benefits from Hale staying in business. So we've lost. Probably. The hearing's in 10 days. I'll present my case, Hale's lawyers will shred it, and the judge will rule that improperly obtained evidence is inadmissible. Everything you risked, everything Crow and Gideon sacrificed, it'll be dismissed as the illegal actions of a vengeful drifter and a corrupt sheriff." Hendricks gathered the papers into a pile. "And there's not a damn thing I can do about it because the system protects itself." "Then we change the system. With what? Hope? Determination? Those aren't currencies the law recognizes." Ronin stared at the stack of papers, thinking about all the words written down, all the evidence carefully documented, all the truth preserved on pages that were about to be declared worthless. Then something occurred to him. The stage driver, the one who brought Gideon back from Black Hollow, does he make regular runs? Twice a week. Why? Because if documents can't go through official channels, maybe they go through unofficial ones. Ronin's mind was working faster now. "You said Hale's influence extends through the territory, but does it extend to the federal government? To Washington?" Hendricks looked up sharply. "You're talking about going over the territorial authority's head. I'm talking about sending copies of everything we have directly to someone who can't be bought by a frontier banker. Someone whose jurisdiction supersedes territorial courts. That would be a senator, or someone in the Interior Department. But even if we could get the documents to Washington, there's no guarantee anyone would care about a corruption case in a backwater territory. They've got bigger problems." "Maybe. But sending them costs nothing except paper and postage. And if there's even a chance someone with real authority sees what Hale's been doing, isn't that worth the price of a package?" Hendricks was quiet, thinking. It would take weeks, maybe months before anyone even opened the package. By then, the territorial court will have ruled, and Hale will have had time to cover any remaining tracks. So we're not doing it to save this case. We're doing it to plant seeds for the next one. For when Hale gets comfortable again and starts over, because men like him always start over. Ronin leaned forward. "You said truth only wins when people are brave enough to speak it. Right now, we're the only ones speaking. But if someone in Washington hears us, maybe next time there'll be more voices. Maybe eventually there'll be enough that even Hale can't silence them all." The marshal studied him for a long moment. "You're talking about a fight that could last years, that you might not live to see finished. I've spent 6 years running from fights that needed fighting. Maybe it's time I started one worth finishing, even if someone else has to end it." They spent the next day preparing a package for Washington. Every copied document, every letter Margaret Finch had written, every piece of evidence they'd gathered. Hendricks added his own report, detailing the investigation and the systematic obstruction he'd encountered. They addressed it to 3 different offices: the Interior Department, a Senate Committee on Territorial Affairs, and a federal prosecutor known for taking corruption cases others avoided. The stage driver who'd brought Gideon back agreed to carry the packages east, bypassing the territorial postal system where Hale's influence could intercept them. It cost most of the money Ronin had left, but money spent on truth was money that might actually matter. The hearing came 9 days later. Ronin attended despite Hendricks' advice, sitting in the back of the territorial courtroom while lawyers argued about procedure and admissibility and whether evidence obtained through illegal means could be considered by a court interested in justice. Hale sat at the defendant's table looking calm and confident, occasionally whispering to his lawyers, but mostly just existing as the picture of respectable innocence. He saw Ronin in the gallery and smiled slightly, a small acknowledgement between men who both knew how this would end. The judge, Hale's brother-in-law, though nobody mentioned that inconvenient fact, listened to arguments with the appearance of impartiality. He asked pointed questions of Hendricks about chain of custody and proper procedure. He nodded sympathetically when Hale's lawyers described the violation of their client's rights. He gave every impression of a man seriously considering the law. Then he ruled exactly as everyone knew he would. The evidence was inadmissible. The investigation was improperly conducted. Marshal Hendricks was ordered to cease all activities related to the case and return any remaining documentation to the territorial court's custody for proper handling. Mercer Hale was owed an apology for the harassment and damage to his reputation. It was thorough, professional, completely predictable. Outside the courthouse, Hendricks looked like a man who'd watched his work get burned. That's it, we're done. I can appeal, but it'll go nowhere. The system closed ranks. Maybe not completely, Ronin said. We still sent those packages east, which won't matter for months, if they matter at all. Meanwhile, Hale wins. He goes back to Black Hollow, resumes operations, and everyone who stood against him learns that resistance costs more than submission. Hendricks turned away. I'm sorry, Vale. I thought we had a chance. We did have a chance. Still might. Ronin looked back at the courthouse where Hale was descending the steps, surrounded by lawyers and well-wishers. Sometimes chances don't pay off right away. That doesn't mean they were wasted. But watching Hale walk away free, watching the system absorb a challenge and continue unchanged, Ronin had to wonder if chances without results were just another word for failure. 4 weeks passed. Ronin stayed in the capital, taking odd jobs to pay for his room, waiting for word from Washington that didn't come. Gideon recovered from his imprisonment, started helping Martha around the boarding house, becoming part of the small community of people who existed in the margins of official life. Hendricks went back to his regular duties, investigating crimes that had clearer jurisdictions and simpler villains. He didn't mention Hale or Black Hollow, and Ronin understood that sometimes silence was how men processed defeat. Then, on a Tuesday morning when nothing seemed particularly important, everything changed. Martha brought a telegram to breakfast. It was addressed to Hendricks, but delivered to the boarding house because the marshal had listed it as a contact point for the Black Hollow case. She handed it to Ronin with a look that suggested she'd already guessed it was important. Ronin read it twice before his hands stopped shaking. The federal prosecutor in Washington had opened an investigation based on the documents they'd sent. Not just into Hale, but into the territorial court system that had protected him. The Interior Department was sending investigators. A Senate committee wanted testimony. And most importantly, they'd discovered something in Hale's records that connected him to a federal bank fraud case in 3 other territories, a pattern of corruption large enough that ignoring it would have political consequences. Ronin ran to Hendricks's office, bursting in without knocking. The marshal looked up from his paperwork, startled, then saw Ronin's face and the telegram in his hand. Is that? Read it. Hendricks read, and with each line his expression shifted from skepticism to surprise to something that might have been hope. When he finished, he set the telegram down carefully, like it might disappear if handled roughly. They're actually coming. Federal investigators with authority that supersedes the territorial court. He looked at Ronin. How did you know? How did you know they'd care? I didn't, but I knew not trying guaranteed failure, and trying at least gave failure company. The federal investigators arrived 3 weeks later. 2 men with credentials that made territorial officials nervous and questions that made them scared. They set up in a hotel room that became a temporary office, and they started systematically dismantling the protections Hale had built around his operation. They interviewed everyone. People who'd been too frightened to talk to Hendricks found courage when faced with federal authority that couldn't be threatened or bought. Margaret Finch reappeared, brought in by marshals who'd tracked her to a sister's house 2 territories away. She testified for 6 hours. Her unsent letters entered into federal record, her voice finally heard by people with the power to act. Witnesses who'd recanted their stories, recanted their recantations, explaining with shaking voices how Hale's men had visited them, made clear what would happen if they spoke. The pattern was undeniable, documented, impossible to dismiss as isolated incidents or misunderstandings. Hale tried to run when he realized how thoroughly his empire was collapsing. They caught him 2 days outside Black Hollow, arrested him with federal warrants that his brother-in-law couldn't dismiss or delay. Fletcher tried to negotiate immunity in exchange for testimony. They didn't need his testimony, too many others were talking now, but they accepted it anyway, using his words to corroborate what 16 victims had already confirmed. The territorial judge recused himself, which wasn't quite the same as admitting bias, but acknowledged enough that his career was effectively over. The land office was placed under federal oversight pending reform. The sheriff's position in Black Hollow stood empty, waiting for someone willing to do the job Crow had forgotten how to do. It took 4 months from the day the investigators arrived to the day Hale stood before a federal judge and heard his sentence. Ronin was there, sitting next to Gideon, watching a man who'd seemed untouchable receive 20 years in a federal prison where connections meant nothing and money bought only what the guards decided to sell. When it was over, when Hale had been led away in chains and the courtroom had emptied, Ronin and Gideon walked outside into afternoon sunlight that felt cleaner than it had months ago. "It's done," Gideon said. "Most of it." Ronin pulled out a piece of paper he'd been carrying for weeks, an official document from the federal court. "The judge ruled that because my debt was pursued through a fraudulent system, the claim against Ash is void. Legally, I never owed anything. The original loan was legitimate, but everything built on top of it was criminal. So you're clear." "Technically," Ronin folded the paper carefully, "but being legally clear doesn't change that I borrowed money I couldn't pay back, that I used a fake name and listed collateral I intended to reclaim. The system Hale built was wrong, but my contribution to it wasn't right." "You're too hard on yourself." "Maybe, or maybe I'm just learning that being better than the worst person in a situation doesn't make you good. It just makes you less bad." Ronin looked toward where Ash waited, tied to a post outside the courthouse. The horse had been through everything with him: the running, the fighting, the long nights when giving up seemed easier than continuing. "I came to Black Hollow to settle a debt and ended up starting a war. People died. Good people, flawed people, but people who deserved better than being casualties in someone else's fight. Crow made his own choice." "I know, but I gave him the reason to make it. That counts for something." They were quiet for a moment. Down the street, life continued with the persistent ordinariness of a world that didn't stop for individual battles. People bought things, argued over prices, courted and quarreled, and conducted the small negotiations of existence that added up to lives. "What now?" Gideon asked. "Now I ride. There's nothing keeping me here anymore. The debt's settled, the evidence is delivered, and Hale's facing consequences that don't need me watching to make them real." Ronin started walking toward Ash. "You should come with me. Nothing keeping you here either, and you've earned some peace." "Too old for peace? It gets boring." But Gideon was smiling. "Besides, Martha offered me permanent room and board in exchange for helping around the boarding house. Turns out I'm good at fixing things that are broken, as long as they're made of wood and not people." "You fixed me a little. Back in Black Hollow, when you could have turned me away. Didn't fix you. Just gave you a place to stand long enough that you remembered how." Gideon extended his hand. "You take care of yourself, Ronin Vale. And that horse. He's better than most people deserve." They shook, holding it longer than necessary, acknowledging what they'd been through without needing to catalog it. Then Ronin mounted Ash and turned toward the edge of town. Hendricks caught up with him at the town limits, riding a horse that looked uncomfortable, carrying a federal marshal who preferred desks to saddles. "Leaving without saying goodbye?" "Figured you were busy. Federal investigations generate a lot of paperwork." "Always." Hendricks pulled his horse alongside Ash. "Where are you headed?" "Away. Maybe west. Maybe just wherever seems right when I get there." "Running again." "Moving," Ronin corrected. "There's a difference. Running is trying to get away from something. Moving is trying to get towards something, even if you don't know what that something is yet. Hendricks considered this. The victims from Black Hollow, all 16 of them, are getting restitution from Hale's seized assets. Not everything they lost, but enough to rebuild. Margaret Finch is getting her store back, clear deed, no debt. The others are getting similar treatment. It's not perfect justice, but it's something. That's good. It wouldn't have happened without you. Without you refusing to let it go, refusing to just ride away when things got complicated. The marshal shifted in his saddle. I wanted you to know that. Whatever else you think about what happened, however you judge your own choices, you made a difference. That counts. Does it? People died, Marshal. Crow and probably others I don't even know about. Dorian's family is living somewhere under a different name, always looking over their shoulders. The price of making a difference was paid by people who didn't choose to pay it. That's always the price. Change doesn't happen cleanly. It happens messy, with casualties and compromise and outcomes that don't satisfy anyone completely. Hendricks's voice was firm. But the alternative is standing by while bad men do bad things, and that price gets paid in slower ways that are somehow worse because they're invisible. You chose action over comfort. That's rare enough that it's worth something. Ronin didn't have an answer for that. Maybe there wasn't one. Maybe making peace with what he'd done meant accepting that he'd never fully know if he'd made the right choices, only that he'd made choices and lived with their consequences as best he could. Take care, Marshal. You too, Vale. Try not to ride into any more wars. I'll do my best. He rode west out of the capital, letting Ash set the pace, feeling the weight of the last few months settle into something that might eventually become understanding. The frontier stretched ahead, vast and indifferent, offering no answers but plenty of space to keep looking for them. Behind him, in a town called Black Hollow, people were learning to live without fear directing their movements. The process would be slow, complicated by habit and memory, and the caution that came from years of learning that standing up meant getting knocked down. But they were learning, and that was something. The sun was setting by the time Ronin made camp that night, choosing a spot where a creek ran clear and the ground was level enough for comfort. He unsaddled Ash, brushed him down, made sure the horse had everything he needed. Then he built a small fire and sat watching stars emerge from the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, Mercer Hale sat in a cell confronting a future much narrower than the empire he'd built. Fletcher and his hired guns were scattered, their employment terminated, their skills worth less in a world that had seen their failure. The territorial judge was probably drinking alone, wondering how his carefully constructed life had collapsed so completely. And 16 people were going to bed tonight with the knowledge that someone had stood up for them, that their suffering hadn't been invisible, that justice, however delayed and imperfect, had arrived because one man refused to just keep riding. Ronin didn't know if that balanced the ledger. Didn't know if Crow's death and Gideon's imprisonment and all the chaos he'd caused added up to something worth the price paid. But he knew he'd stopped running long enough to stand for something, and that standing had mattered to people who'd forgotten what it looked like when someone stood. Maybe that was enough. Maybe it would have to be. He finished his coffee, kicked dirt over the fire, and lay down with his saddle as a pillow and the sound of Ash breathing nearby. Sleep came easier than it had in months, untroubled by the ghosts that usually kept him company. In the morning, he woke to sunlight and the smell of sage, and the quiet certainty that for the first time in 6 years, he wasn't running from anything. He was just moving forward, carrying nothing more than what fit in his saddlebags and the knowledge that he'd finished something worth starting. Ronin mounted Ash and rode toward the horizon, leaving Black Hollow behind but carrying its lessons forward. The frontier was still vast, still unforgiving, still full of places where injustice wore respectable clothes. But somewhere in that vastness, people were learning that systems could be challenged, that empires could fall, that standing up was hard, but not impossible. And if nothing else, that was a story worth the telling.